Welcome to day two on the Congress, and today we're going to talk about the power of the purse and federal budgets or fiscal policy, that is the relationship between revenues and expenditures. So I'm going to start right in with screen sharing, and hopefully I have solved my issues with the audio so that you'll be able to see and hear the videos that I'm sharing. So if we go here, I want to start with an ad from Senator Ernst and her 2014 Senate campaign.
I'm Joni Ernst. I grew up castrating hogs on an Iowa farm. So when I get to Washington, I'll know how to cut pork.
Joni Ernst, mother, soldier, conservative.
My parents taught us to live within our means. It's time to force Washington to do the same. To cut wasteful spending, repeal Obamacare, and balance the budget. I'm Joni Ernst, and I approve this message because Washington's full of big spenders. Let's make them squeal.
Okay, so this ad launched her to national prominence and invigorated her 2014 Senate campaign when she won the seat and became Iowa's first female member of the United States Congress in our history. So let's go back and talk a little bit about some of the pieces she's discussing here.
I'm Joni Ernst. I grew up castrating hogs on an Iowa farm.
So for a lot of the national media, this led to ridicule. People kind of joked about her making that statement. And for most of you, that statement probably doesn't resonate. But that statement gave her a lot of credibility, particularly in rural parts of the state or with voters who grew up in rural parts of the state and may now live in Des Moines or Cedar Rapids or one of the cities.
So when I get to Washington, I'll know how to cut pork.
So she used this metaphor of castrating pigs as a metaphor for cutting pork. But what she means here by pork is pork barrel spending. So pork barrel spending is a term that references spending by Congress that benefits a small constituency, but is paid for by taxpayers generally. And it is seen as a wasteful way that Congress spends money because the benefits, again, go to a select subset but are paid for by everyone, particularly problematic when we're spending more than we're bringing in revenue. Arguably, the most famous example of pork barrel spending was something known as the Bridge to Nowhere. This was a bridge up in rural Alaska from Ketchikan, Alaska, to a place called Gravina Island. And Congress allocated between $300 and $400 million to build a bridge from Ketchikan, Alaska to Gravina Island. The reason they allocated that money was because Alaska had at the time one of the most prominent and most senior senators in the United States Senate, a guy named Ted Stevens. And Senator Stevens wanted that project because it created economic opportunity. It created jobs building the bridge. It would create the supplies being put into that bridge would come from Alaska companies. And then those workers who were building that bridge would have to pay for housing and pay for food, and all of that money would cycle through the economy of Alaska, stimulating their economy, and essentially the rest of the country would pay for it. And that would build political capital and build loyalty among voters in Alaska for Ted Stevens, who was responsible for getting that $400 million spent. So members of Congress like to do it because their constituents like to receive those benefits, and the cost is dispersed among the country as a whole. So benefits are very concentrated and build a lot of loyalty, but because the costs are dispersed across the country as a whole, it's hard to build up a lot of coherent opposition. Now that Bridge to Nowhere example is one where it caught the national attention.
Joni Ernst, mother, soldier, conservative.
My parents taught us to live within our means. It's time to force Washington to do the same.
So Senator Ernst is talking here about what we call fiscal responsibility, to balance the national budget. So we have this relationship between revenues and expenditures. And if they're equal, that's called a balanced budget. If expenditures exceed revenues, that's called deficit spending. And if revenues exceed expenditures, that's called having a surplus. And so the longer we run at a surplus, that can allow us to address our national debt issue. But the longer we run at a deficit, the bigger the national debt gets.
To cut wasteful spending, repeal Obamacare, and balance the budget. I'm Joni Ernst, and I approve this message because Washington's full of big spenders. Let's make them squeal.
So in this last comment is kind of an attack on Congress generally. And one of the things about Congress that's important to remember is while there are 535 members of Congress, you as a voter only have control through the ballot over 3 of them, your 2 senators and your 1 member of the House. And that's part of why Congress has such a low approval rating, is there's this resentment, this hostility towards members of Congress from other states because they're engaging in this pork barrel spending. They're doing things to benefit their constituents to the detriment of people in our district. And so she's playing on that anti-Congress hostility here and continuing this metaphor of castration, saying, let's make them squeal. Let's emasculate these members of Congress who feel like they're so powerful and in control. So now I want to switch to a different video, and I want to jump in here.
Each year, the executive branch of the federal government submits a budget to Congress detailing the cost of its departments and programs. Should the government spend more money than it earns through taxation, it runs a budget deficit and must borrow to make up the difference. If the government brings in more taxes than it spends, it runs a budget surplus. That surplus can go to pay down the government's national debt, which is the total amount from previous deficits. The government issues new debt through treasury bonds and bills sold to foreign countries, investors, and individual citizens. The total national debt is near $17 trillion.
Now, I think most of you realize that it's much higher than that now and well into the 22, 23 trillion at this point. So the national debt continues to grow.
Throughout history, the United States has only paid off its national debt once, under President Andrew Jackson in 1835. However, a severe depression 2 years later threw the government back into debt, where it has remained ever since.
And you may remember from U.S. history or AP U.S. history, Alexander Hamilton actually made arguments to President Washington that there were benefits in having a national debt at a certain level. It would tie wealthy individuals to the success of the country, and therefore they would be financially vested in whether the country was going to succeed long term.
More recently, the largest deficits have occurred either because of severe economic downturns, as happened during the Great Depression and the 2008 recession, or from tax cuts enacted under the Reagan and Bush administrations. Opponents of deficit spending compare the government to a household, claiming that a household shouldn't spend more than it makes. There are, however, many beneficial instances of home deficit spending. Home mortgages make it possible to eventually own property. Taking out student loans can lead to a rewarding career, and taking a car loan can allow a worker to travel to a higher-paying job. This is true for the government as well. The social programs of the 1930s and the vast amounts of military spending during World War II are credited with lifting us out of the Great Depression and winning the war. Neither would have been possible without deficit spending. In fact, requiring a balanced budget could be very detrimental in economic downturns.
So this this video is predicated, you may notice, on Keynesian economics. In US history, you likely learned about John Maynard Keynes, the Nobel Prize winning economist, who talked about in times of economic crisis, that the government is the only actor large enough in the marketplace to stimulate the economy out of that crisis. So that's what the whole New Deal programs of Franklin Roosevelt were predicated on. That's what the stimulus efforts of both the Bush and Obama administrations with the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. And we're seeing a lot of discussions about that right now in the midst of the economic downturn associated with coronavirus. Now, that's not the only economic school of thought, and the counter school to that would be Austrian school economics with Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, that kind of counterbalance to John Maynard Keynes. And so the Austrian school is more of a free market, limited government intervention model. And they believe that the government intervention in the marketplace, rather than stimulating us out of a recession, is an inefficiency that hinders the ability of the market to correct itself.
When the government needs to intervene to stimulate the economy and labor market, or in a time of war, when the country is facing an existential crisis. Too much deficit spending can be problematic over the long term. The accumulated interest payments can severely hamper the federal government's ability to function. To prevent this from happening, Congress created the debt ceiling in 1917 to put a limit on the amount of debt the federal government can issue. Since then, it has been raised over 95 times, both to accommodate more debt and to account for inflation. Throughout the history of the United States, many significant reductions of the national debt have been followed by economic downturns. Projections for the debt growing or shrinking change rapidly and are intimately tied to the unemployment rate and the overall health of the economy. As more people begin working, more taxes are collected and deficit projections go down. This low unemployment then stimulates the economy because so many workers are receiving a regular paycheck to spend at the grocery store, the hair salon, the hardware store, or various other establishments. At the moment, the best practice for the deficit appears to be framing the budget around the realities of the current state of the nation's economy, while finding a long-term means to lower the debt for future generations.
So now I want to switch from that to this diagram. Please move the window. Stop sharing for a second here, and now I'm going to reshare and see if this will help to have this show up better. Seems to be showing up better now from my side. I don't know if it matters on your side at all or not. So I'm gonna pen here. So we can see the national debt, and we can see that in 1940 right here, the national debt was very low. And for much of, you see this increase from 40 to 45, which is attributable to World War I, or excuse me, World War II. I'm gonna erase that. That didn't work, trying to write World War II. So we're just gonna know that that increase between 40 and 45 is a function of World War II. So then you'll notice that in the post-war era, our national debt was relatively constant. It was going up slightly, but we didn't see the type of deficit spending that we had seen during the war. And then in the 80s, we started to see a significant increase in deficit spending. As we look at that increase in the national debt, this is in total dollars, in trillions of dollars, we either here have an increase in expenditures or a decrease in revenue or both. And then in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, we noticed that the chart kind of leveled off here. We actually, through the combination of fiscal responsibility by Congress under the leadership of Newt Gingrich, a Republican Speaker of the House, and the Clinton administration, President Bill Clinton, the two of them acted as checks on one another. And we balanced the budget, and then we actually ran at budget surpluses for a couple of years, and were able to stop the growth of the national debt. And then September 11th, 2001, paired with tax cuts, those two things combined to cut revenue and increase expenditures, and again, the national debt took off. So I'm going to clear these drawings. So that looks at the national debt in terms of total dollar amounts. But now I want to close that and see if let me scroll down here. But economists tend to look at the national debt not in total dollar amounts, but in terms of a function of GDP. So I'm gonna get my pencil back here. So the national debt, US federal debt, as a function, as a percent of GDP. Now, the reason this makes sense, I like to use a personal example here. Let's say I owe $10 million. I make about $70,000 a year. If I owe $10 million, that's a crippling debt. That's a debt I will never repay. There's no way for me to earn enough money in the remainder of my life to pay off a $10 million debt. But if my economic situation were to change, and I were to change from my current level of revenue to, say, the level of revenue that LeBron James makes at about $75 million a year, now a $10 million debt, while not a great thing, is a much more manageable situation. You know, 1/7, 1/8 of his annual income, he could borrow $10 million, easily pay it off at the end of a year or over the course of several years, and it really wouldn't impact him that dramatically. It would be bad for him to owe $10 million, but not as terrible as it would be for me. But let's extrapolate again from LeBron James to, say, Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett was just in the news today. So Warren Buffett, and if we look at Warren Buffett's income, and the last time I looked it up, that given year, I think he made something like 13 billion that year. So if you take someone who makes $13 billion in a year and you have a debt of $10 million, that is nothing to them. It's insignificant. He can spend $10 million and it means nothing. And so that's why we look at the national debt as a percent of GDP. So comparing to that previous chart where it was put in total dollar amounts, if we look at 1940 to 45, which would fall right here, that deficit spending was very significant. Even more so, the jump is more dramatic. We actually exceeded, our national debt exceeded the total GDP for the country back at the height of that deficit war spending. But then after the war, when we stopped deficit spending, but the debt stayed constant, as a percent of GDP, it declined because the economy grew in the post-war prosperity of the 50s and 60s. And so as the economy grew, it was like moving from my income to LeBron James's income. And now owing the same amount of money is less and less significant. Then you notice 1980 right here, again, that turning point where deficit spending started to grow. So that deficit spending in the 80s is not as dramatic on this chart because, again, the economy was growing at the same time. So even though we were deficit spending at high rates, because the economy was growing quickly, it balanced it out somewhat, so the spike wasn't as dramatic. Now here you can see those late 90s where the economy was still growing. We had this tech boom because this great new thing called the internet showed up in the late 90s. And in the midst of that tech boom, paired with first balanced budgets and later surpluses, and the national debt as a percent of GDP declined. Then we see again deficit spending and a drop in revenue caused it to increase, although the economy was not as crippled in the lead up to the bubble in 2008. And then after the economy tanked in 2008 and we fell into that Great Recession, the same levels of deficit spending, because the late Bush administration, we saw some massive stimulus packages, and then that continued into Obama, the Obama administration. So as the economy fell into recession, the economy tanked, the GDP declined, the same level of deficit spending saw a big spike there again. So from the perspective of economists, it's not just the total dollar amount that's most significant in terms of the debt, but how it relates to how the economy is doing generally, like the video said. So I'm gonna stop drawing there and scroll down. Whoops, I should have erased my drawings, sorry. Let me clear all drawings, there we go. And now let's go down And this graphic with the presidents, now this was a graphic from 2009, so very early in the Obama administration, in the midst of the stimulus. So I don't know how significant the deficit spending was as a percent of GDP for the entirety of Obama's administration, but in that first first year of his presidency, it was very significant. But what I wanted to point out is deficit spending is a bipartisan problem. Kennedy and Johnson were Democrats, they deficit spent. Nixon and Ford were Republicans, they deficit spent. Carter, Democrat, deficit spent. Reagan, Bush, Republicans, deficit spent. We have that anomaly of the Clinton years when Newt Gingrich was the speaker, where we actually saw a significant decline in deficit spending. Bush deficit spent, Obama deficit spent, and Trump has deficit spent. And so this is not something that is necessarily partisan. It's a bipartisan challenge to get both administrations to recommend budgets that are balanced and to get Congress to exercise fiscal responsibility. Congress tends to not like being fiscally responsible because they like to win favor with voters, and voters generally don't reward fiscal responsibility. They prefer getting the benefits of barrel spending. So again, now I've got my pencil here, and you can see that this is from the 2017 exam, because this is in black. I'm going to change colors, change to red. So the 2017 AP exam, and you see this is a quantitative analysis question. Now for next Monday's exam, there's not a quantitative analysis question, but it's just a policy response question and the argumentation question, but this is really good content that could tie into one of those policy questions. So as we look at these charts, part one says, or part A says, identify a change in federal spending between 1970 and 2023 projected. So we have these broad categories: discretionary spending and mandatory spending, and then mandatory programs, discretionary spending, and then net interest on the debt. So you can see, now it also tells us that mandatory programs include Social Security, federal health programs, that would be Medicare, Medicaid, and other entitlement programs. So you can see that from 1970 to 2023, a dramatic shift from mandatory programs making up 31% of the budget to making up 63% of the budget, discretionary spending dropping to only 23%. So again, mandatory programs include Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, SSI disability, veterans benefits. Those are mandatory spending programs. By law, Congress can't change those in the budget. They would have to change the underlying statutes that create those benefits. Discretionary spending is everything else. That is, the farm bill, that is military spending, that is spending on education, that's all the stimulus stuff we're seeing. That is the regulatory budgets for different agencies. That is the NASA budget, that is foreign aid. All of that, transportation, that all falls into discretionary spending. And you see that the net interest on the debt as a percent of the federal budget doubles from 7% to 14%. So I'm going to change colors again here. Describe the difference between entitlement and discretionary programs. So entitlement programs, again, those are things that by law, Congress has to pay for those entitlements at the levels set in the statutes. And they don't have control over it in the budget process like they do with those discretionary items. Part C, describe one demographic trend that has contributed to changes in entitlement spending. So as I've said before, in conjunction with our look at demographics, Social Security and then those health programs, Medicare and Medicaid, overwhelmingly benefit old people. As the population has aged and baby boomers have moved into that age category entitled to those programs have reached the age of 65, we have more recipients and they're living longer, and those things have driven the costs up of those mandatory programs because you're paying for more people and those people are living longer, so you're paying benefits longer. So those are actually two demographic trends. Explain why entitlements spending make balancing the budget difficult. As we said in the previous unit, old people vote at the highest rates, and Congress doesn't want to anger them, so Congress is reluctant to cut those programs that disproportionately benefit old people. And so the popularity of mandatory spending programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, among the people who vote at the highest rates, make it likely that Congress is not going to change them anytime soon. And then the last one, explain how deficit spending, that is spending more money than is coming in revenue, affects the projected net interest. So they want you to know here that net interest is interest on the debt. So as the debt grows, so back here, the debt was smaller, and so you had a lower interest payment. As the debt grows, the percent of the national budget that goes to pay interest increases. Now, astute students often point out, wait a minute, from 1970 to 2012, the debt grew, that deficit spending of the 1980s, but the net interest, or the interest on the debt as a percent of the federal budget actually went down. There are a couple of factors there. One, the entirety of the national budget grew, and so that as a percent of the national budget, the interest shrunk slightly there. And the other part is the debt was refinanced. So you may remember in US history learning about something called stagflation in the 1970s, where interest rates were at astronomical rates. When I was your age, when I was in high school, I had a CD that was paying 13% interest on a certificate of deposit. If you go out and try to get a certificate of deposit today, you'd be lucky to get 1 or 2% on a CD. So the federal government was able to effectively refinance their debt at much lower rates as we came out of stagflation and interest rates declined. And so as a percent of the national budget, net interest declined there. But as we see by 2023, net interest on the debt is going to make up a more significant portion because we continue to deficit spend again and again and again. So now let's clear all drawings, stop the slide share, and that's where I'm going to end for tonight. So we'll see you back here Wednesday, another 8 p.m. Wednesday Zoom, and I look forward to seeing you if you're able to join us.